you got to have a clear reason for doing things, I think. Otherwise, you're not going to keep it up. I often say that if you're going to use Japanese in business, I think it's all or nothing, because anything in the middle is just going to lead to confusion and probably frustration on both sides, you know.
こんにちは、皆さん。ビジネスサクセスジャパンのポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Lydia Bugelman. My main goal here is to create an easily accessible resource for those who want to develop Japan-specific communication skills, especially in business. While I can't and won't promise to make you fluent in Japanese, I hope that you will walk away from each episode with a skill, piece of information, or shift in mindset that will help you be more effective in your interactions with Japanese business people. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing a conversation with Graeme Lawrence, an award-winning specialist in Japanese with an extensive history in Japan and Japanese translation. I won't spoil too much of his story here, as he does a great job of sharing his background in the interview. But for anyone with any interest in seriously committing to learning Japanese, this is an episode you definitely won't want to miss. But before we get into the episode, let's go over a little bit of Japanese. I want to take a second to properly introduce another important Japanese phrase for business that Ken Okamoto covered last week. Nemawashi. Ne, ma, wa, shi. Nemawashi. Literally, nemawashi is a term that refers to the practice of digging around roots before transplanting a tree. In a business context, it refers to the work that Japanese people put into laying the groundwork before a meeting. Usually, this involves building consensus among people in the company before making proposals or decisions. Although it may seem cumbersome and time-consuming, it creates a sense of buy-in from all parties involved that can allow people to be more engaged and committed once the formal decision is made. Be sure to listen to the previous episode to hear a little bit more about some of the difficulties this can raise for non-Japanese people in Japan. Also, one final note before we get into the interview. There was a point in the audio where it was difficult to hear what I was saying while Graeme and I were discussing tools for learning Japanese. So, be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode for a list of some of the resources that we mentioned. All right, let's get into today's conversation.
My name's Graeme Lawrence. I'm based in the UK, and I work as a full-time interpreter and translator.
Could you tell us a little bit about your history with Japan?
I can do. I'll give you the shortened version, but it goes back to when I was in high school, or actually before that. I got into Japan through the martial arts route. In those days, karate was very popular, and the first Japanese words I learned were actually karate based. And we might talk about that later. But I feel that using your body, moving your body whilst learning a language is actually a very effective way of remembering things. And so the Japanese I learned started by doing that.
So what drew you to learning more about Japan then? Because a lot of times people tend to compartmentalize things like martial arts in the sense that they'll be like, oh, this is just a sport. This is just exercise. They don't necessarily go on to become interested in the host culture.
Yeah, well, I think I was probably very lucky. I had two instructors, both of whom had lived in Japan for more than 5 years each. And the reason they went to Japan was to totally sort of completely dedicate themselves to martial arts training while they were there, which was quite an unusual thing to do in those days. We're talking about the early 80s. So obviously they, gave me lots of stories about their time there and how they were forced to learn the language because, unlike now, the train signs were only in Japanese, and what I mean is there was very little English available in Japan at that time, so you had to learn Japanese if you were going to go beyond just the surface. So to really understand what the masters were teaching, they had to learn Japanese, and so they passed that on to me. And I realized at that point that if I was going to do the same thing and follow in their footsteps, and I had to learn Japanese to a very high level as well. I'll give you an example as to why something like karate is good for learning. Let's take the name of a technique, soto ude uke. Soto is outside, ude is arm, uke is a block. So just there, you've learnt 3 fairly useful words. And of course, the counting is all done in Japanese as well. We used to count 1 to 10 very quickly whilst performing the techniques. It's ni, san, shi, go, roku, shichi, hachi, kuju, like that. So, it's very easy to absorb language if you're listening to it whilst, performing some sort of movement at the same time.
So then, was there another thing that you became interested with Japanese culture, or was this thread of martial arts kind of the main thing that drew you into? And
Yeah, it's certainly what drew me into it. I mean, we could probably even go back one stage further. When I was probably about 9 years old, my grandfather made a samurai castle for me. There was a TV show on at the time called Shogun, which I think most people have probably heard of. The James Clavell novel, and so I watched that, and that made me think, wow, there's a whole completely new culture out there. It's very, very different from what I was used to in the UK, and that certainly piqued my interest. So I don't know, all the sort of, it's some sort of fate perhaps, because one thing has led to another. And actually, because of that and learning Japanese, I ended up having a career that was totally based around using Japanese and understanding Japanese culture in a business context. And that's carried on now since, the late 80s until now.
I think that a lot of people have those early childhood exposures to Japan that just make them realize that, oh, the world isn't just like this country that I happen to be living in. There's so much more out there that I can go explore.
Yeah, definitely, and of course these days even more so. I expect. I mean, teenagers are often into manga or anime or the kawaii culture, aren't they? Which is totally alien to me, I should add. I really don't understand that, but computer games is another one. So there's so much sort of so-called cool Japan pop culture out there now, isn't there, to attract young people, which wasn't around in my day. But I totally understand why younger people could be attracted now.
So then you mentioned that now your career has revolved pretty much completely around the Japanese language. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do now?
Certainly. Well, I work as a full-time translator and interpreter in a Japanese company. I've done that for, many, many years in quite a number of different companies and industries. So what that means is that a typical day would consist of interpreting business meetings. At the moment, most of those are done online. They're done via Teams or Skype. And then after that, you might switch to doing a translation task. And then you might be called in to assist with some sort of cross-cultural matter. So a typical day will be broken down into those 3 elements, and it's just like that from morning till night, really. And I mean, that I've done that for many, many years, but the industries that I've worked in have been quite varied. So that, I think, is one of the great benefits of learning Japanese and then being able to use it in work, is that the sheer variety of things that you can do through that.
That is very interesting that you can kind of go broad instead of niching down into one thing, because something I hear a lot, especially from translators, is find your niche, find something very specific, get really good at it, and that's what you'll do for the rest of your life. So it's interesting to see more of a broad career in Japanese translation.
Well, Lydia, I've perhaps got some controversial views that a lot of translators might not agree with, but I've found that if you've got a good solid core of understanding business Japanese, you can apply that wherever you need to. Now, of course, you need the specialist knowledge in certain industries, but you can pick that up almost as a sort of on-the-job training, so to speak. But without the core, those foundations, then you can't start to begin with. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. I started off in logistics. That was back in the late 80s, and then moved on to the translation industry itself. Worked for a translation company as a Japanese consultant. And then the automotive industry, followed by mobile communications. These were Japanese mobile phones, which were quite different from the type of mobile phones that we used in Europe at the time. So there was a distinct Japanese influence there, which was very interesting for me. The Japanese were trying to export their technology overseas, and it was interesting to see how that technology succeeded or didn't succeed outside of Japan. And that was followed by, believe it or not, it was enzymes. Now, this again is a very Japanese sort of industry, because it relies on some of the traditional Japanese technology, like fermented foods, for example. And so the Japanese are experts in that field, and it was fascinating for me to see how their technology could be exported around the world. And then after that, I went into nuclear power. Now, controversial subject, but of course, the Japanese have a long history of working in nuclear, and they were attempting to export their technology outside of Japan. And we all know that the nuclear industry is controversial even within Japan after the Fukushima accident. So all of these industries were sort of very Japanese influenced, and that for me was quite fascinating to work within those organizations.
It's good to hear that the careers available to you are so diverse, and that once you have that core, you can apply it so broadly. That's very encouraging.
I think you can, because there are recurring themes through all of them. That you have the same sort of business, so the same. You have to deal with the finance matters. You have to deal with HR matters, project planning. That tends to be very similar across all industries. So once you get used to the sort of particular language of that industry or that project, then you definitely can transfer your skills. But as I said at the beginning, you have to know the core to start with. So what I would say to anybody who's starting out in their career is to read as many business related books as you can about different industries, but really understand sort of the basic terminology that's used across planning, management, finance, human resources, and then you can probably use that anywhere.
It's very interesting. And that core would also include Keigo, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's essential. That's a good point, actually. Keigo, of course, I'm sure all your listeners know, but this is the polite way of using Japanese in a business context. I would suggest that you grasp the basic structures of Keigo, because you'll be using that all day long, and all emails, of course, use Keigo. So once you understand those basic patterns, all you have to do is change the keywords that are specific to that company or that project, and you're away. So yeah, definitely put in the hours mastering the Keigo. It can be done.
Yeah, for sure. Because it is very structured, it's very particular, but what's nice about both of those things is that once you know how to do them, it's actually less work, because you just have to change out the information and the rest is kind of already there.
Yeah, they are the same old patterns, aren't they? So
Yeah.
And also I read or hear a lot from people learning Japanese that Keigo is difficult. Well, of course it is. But if you can take the time to grasp it as best you can, then that will set you apart from other people. And I think the Japanese like to hear Keigo. And if you use Keigo, they will really warm to you. And some people might say, oh, no, you don't need to do it. It's a waste of time. But if you're going to use Japanese in business, then definitely spend as much time as you can on Keigo.
But do you even think that Japanese is important for somebody who wants to be successful in doing business in Japan? Can't they just get an interpreter to come in and work with them? Do you think that Japanese language skills are foundational to be successful in Japan?
To be successful in Japan? Well, I mean, that's a hard question to answer, because I'm operating outside of Japan at the moment. For the last 20 years, I've been working with European companies. When I lived in Japan, I was there for just under 10 years. This was back in the 90s. I first went there in 89, and that was just for a short karate training trip and to see if I liked the country and if I wanted to live there for longer. So, my background in Japan is from then until 2000. But in those days, I couldn't imagine living in Japan, at least where I lived, which was in Shizuoka, which is sort of away from the major cities. I couldn't imagine living without Japanese. I mean, that was my bread and butter then, of course, as indeed it is now. But my daily life was run through Japanese. So without that, I don't see what the point of going to Japan would have been, really. I mean, yeah, okay, there were people going to teach English, or just solely teaching English, and maybe making a bit of money and then enjoying the experience. But and that's okay if that's what you want to do. But if you want to do business in Japan, yeah, I would say you learn Japanese. You could rely on interpreters, but then you're always going to be relying on other people, and you're going to be missing some things, really. So, if you want to set yourself up as a proper, authentic business person, then I would recommend learning Japanese. But hey, some people I'm sure are going to say that's not necessary. But if you were living in Shizuoka in the 90s, at least, yeah, you had to do that. There, nobody else was going to help you in English.
So what would you say your level in Japanese was about at that time when you first?
Right. When I first learned, well, I put in a good 7 years of study before I went to Japan. So what that meant was that when I arrived, I joined they called an advanced Japanese course at a full-time Japanese language school, because that was the whole reason for my going there in the beginning, was to improve my Japanese and to obviously live in Japan. That means that I could immerse myself in the language and culture all the time. So almost from arrival, I had to go and meet prospective guarantors. For example, to live in Japan as a student, you need to have a guarantor, somebody who will vouch for you if there are any problems. And it's a huge undertaking, because they have to submit lots of private documents and basically put their stamp on something saying that they will bail you out if there are any problems. So all those conversations were done in Japanese, and I think even from day one, really, everything had to be done in Japanese. So I think I was at the level where I could do that. And I'd also spent a lot of time learning to read Japanese before I went, which was a help. Otherwise, you couldn't just join that advanced class if you hadn't done that. And that was a 2-year course that was intended to train people to take entrance exams to Japanese universities. So you can imagine that there was a lot of importance put on reading and writing skills.
This might not be a fair characterization in some ways, but it seems like among language learners lately, because I listen to language acquisition podcasts as well, just in my spare time. The trend lately seems to be very heavy on just talk as much as you can. If you talk as much as you can and speak to as many native speakers as you can, eventually you'll become fluent. But why do you think reading in particular is so important for learning Japanese?
Okay. Well, circumstances, of course. We were all aiming to go into higher education in Japan, which meant that all the lessons were conducted in Japanese. So, and everything had to be, all the material was in Japanese, and all the reports that we had to write, or the exams, were all conducted in written Japanese as well. So there's the answer as to why we needed to be able to read and write Japanese. But also, even if you're not aiming to do that, and I'm sure that's not everybody's sort of cup of tea. Nobody, only very few people, I'm sure, want to actually go down that road. But so even if you're not going, taking it that seriously, at least by learning to read and write means that you can certainly pick up a lot of more language that's around you. I mean, if you can't read, think of how much you're missing just by walking around a town in Japan. The signs in front of you, the newspapers that are, in restaurants or whatever, magazines that are, if you could read that, then you would learn so much more. You could absorb so much more, because it's all around you 24 hours a day. I used to walk around the town in Japan just reading all the signs, because there are a lot of signs in Japan. So you're learning every step you're taking. You're absorbing more and more, aren't you? So there's so much to be gained by reading, picking up a newspaper and seeing what's written in it without relying on news in English. There's a lot more that's only in Japanese. So yeah, if you can do that, you go into a totally different dimension.
Yeah, for sure. I can see how it would speed things up a lot more if you can take that sort of input in as well.
I can understand how people feel if they can't read. I mean, I've been to Korea on a couple of occasions, and there's very little English signage in Korea, and it's all Hangul. And wow, I felt like a total foreigner there, definitely. which is great because it allowed me to understand how people who can't read Japanese must feel when they're in Japan. I don't feel that myself, of course, but I certainly understand now where they're coming from.
It definitely helps with the whole empathy thing.
Yeah, I mean, some people enjoy that, don't they? I know there's a very famous writer who's lived in Japan for something like 30 years, and he says that he doesn't speak very much Japanese, and he certainly can't read any, because he likes to maintain that feeling of everything still being fresh. He likes to still have those looking at everything through new eyes, and he thinks if he were to understand too much, then he would lose that sort of feeling. I mean, that's each to their own. But for me, I wanted to know what was going on around me. I hate that feeling of being like a 2-year-old child,
Right.
not being able to read what's going on around me.
Though to be fair, learning Hangul, the Korean script, doesn't take nearly as much time as learning all of the characters in Japanese.
So. Oh, doesn't it? I'll take your word for that, but
yeah.
I'm afraid I could only handle Japanese. People say, oh, if you can speak Japanese, you must be able to speak other languages. And there are people out there, aren't there, who can do 3 or 4 or 5, I don't know, 10 languages. That's certainly not me. It's taken me all this time to get this far, so I just don't have the capacity for any more. But I've got total respect for anybody who can read Hangul and Japanese.
So then what would you say to somebody who comes up to you and says, oh, it's good for you that you can speak Japanese at such a high level, but I can never do that because it's just too hard and I'm just really bad at learning languages?
Well, I'm not a natural language learner, definitely. The only reason that I've studied so hard is because I needed it as a tool or a medium for doing what I wanted to do. Motivation, of course, is really, really important, isn't it? So, I said at the beginning that I wanted to learn karate in Japan. I needed to speak Japanese to do it. That's why. You got to have a clear reason for doing things, I think. Otherwise, you're not going to keep it up. And this is something that you need to practice on a daily basis, just like any sort of exercise. If you stop practicing, you will start losing your skills. You have to maintain them. So for anybody who says it's really hard, I would, I'd empathise with them. I really understand what they mean. So I often say that if you're going to use Japanese in business, I think it's all or nothing, because anything in the middle is just going to lead to confusion and probably frustration on both sides. So if you're going to use that for business, then you're going to have to really put in the hours to do it. If not, greetings and things will certainly break the ice. But then to avoid any sort of misunderstandings, you probably have to rely on someone else, a translator or interpreter, to help you then. But just by starting to learn the language will give you insights into that culture. So I wouldn't say necessarily don't do it unless you're going to go all the way, but just have realistic sort of expectations.
Right, for sure. Getting the basics down, it helps build rapport, and it helps you kind of understand maybe a Japanese speaker's English, why they structure things the way they do, and what they say and what they don't say. You start to understand that a little bit more intuitively. But if you want to communicate, if you want to conduct business in Japanese, yes, I definitely agree that you need to go all in.
That's a very good point you raised there. Yes, because by understanding how Japanese works, you can often work out what a Japanese Japanese person speaking English is saying. What I mean is if they're not fluent. If they're fluent in English, of course that's another problem. But sometimes somebody who's only perhaps partly fluent in English, they do use a Japanese based structure when they're speaking English, and certain words they use, certain English vocabulary that they choose, you can tell where that has come from. You think, in Japanese that would have been, and that's why they've used that particular way of saying it. So you're quite right there. That certainly does help. I understand that.
So then, apart from this very important motivation, your reasons for learning Japanese, can you think of any other mindsets that are really important for getting to a high level in a language?
it's going to be commitment, isn't it? Which is probably why I like it so much, because I think people who are drawn to martial arts have that sort of mindset to start with. You know, we're always told, aren't we, just to keep repeating things and you know, pushing for the next level. So if you apply that to language, then, you know, I think you've got a good start there. So certainly that commitment, but at the same time, you need to take a break sometimes. This applies to exercise too. Sometimes when you have a week off, or so, when you come back, you feel refreshed. And at least in my case, I feel that sometimes my level has gone up, even though I've had a break. I think it allows you to sort of recharge your battery. So I often would take a few weeks break out of my Japanese studies when I was younger, and just to, you know, get over the burnout, really. So that's important. You have to pace yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In the very early days, I used to use an audio-based course. That was the only thing that was available. But what that course recommended was that you do maybe half an hour practice in the morning and half an hour in the evening, so about an hour a day. And this was self-training, so it was a recording. You'd listen to sentences again and again and again, and then you start repeating yourself along with the tape. And then finally, the last stage would be to turn the tape off and just reproduce the Japanese sentences yourself. So that, again, is a very repetitive method, but and therefore it requires lots of dedication, I think, to keep it up. So just pushing yourself that to go that extra mile, I think that's really quite important. If, like me, you are not a natural language learner.
I would definitely fall into that camp. Spanish in elementary school did not go well for me.
I learned French in the UK and German, but I can't use it. I can't remember any French or German now. So that goes to show, doesn't it? So yeah, it's what you're interested in, I think, that really matters. So, for example, if you want to improve your Japanese skills, I'd suggest finding a hobby that you like that you can do in Japanese. That means you can try to read the magazines related to that hobby, or watch TV programs or YouTube videos. So you start off, of course, with something that you're interested in, and then that means you've already got an understanding of the subject matter. And then, in order to maintain that interest when you're learning Japanese, you just keep looking at things that you want to know, you want to learn about. If you start learning something you're really not interested in through Japanese, it's not going to stick. But if you've got a pastime that you really, really want to follow, and you do that in Japanese, I think you will absorb that language so much quicker.
Because I tried to read relatively widely in Japanese. But anytime that I encounter sports in particular, I'm just like, no, I'm going to skip this and move on to something.
Yeah. I know the feeling, yeah. So, find something you like, and then just, get the dictionaries out and do it word by word if you have to. But,
yeah. It's slow and frustrating, but it does pay off, even if it doesn't feel like it.
There are so many good Japanese speakers out there these days. I come across them on YouTube or the internet all the time. And they're really quite inspiring, aren't they? So the level that some people have achieved, even without going to, live in Japan. I'm fascinated as to how they did that. And I took part in a Japanese business speech contest a little while ago, and there were people there who were fluent in Japanese, and they delivered 10-minute speeches, or who had never lived or worked in Japan. And I thought that was incredible. Mm-hmm. So, that certainly inspired me. That gave me lots of motivation.
Yeah, that fascinates me too, because one of the main reasons I want to go back to Japan is because I feel like that would be the best way for me to increase my own Japanese level. But fascinating to see people who have been able to achieve such high levels without even being there. Some of them have never even been.
Yeah, I had a very brief conversation with one person, and I think he was keeping it, secret what his method was. But I want to find out how this happened. You also come across these sort of immersion courses as well on YouTube, don't you? Where some people have just, I don't know, they spend a couple of months reading nothing but Japanese or something, which I suppose you could do these days if you shut yourself away, as we have been during the COVID shutdown. And, you just watch Japanese films or something on Netflix, and I suppose you could do that. But for me, in those days, the only way to do that was actually to go to Japan. I'm not saying that immersing yourself in Netflix is going to be a replacement for going to Japan, of course, because once you're actually on the ground, you sort of breathe the same air, don't you, as all the culture around you. So you naturally pick up things like mannerisms and body language and these sort of things. I think you have to be there face to face to do.
Because even if you have a very high Japanese language ability, that doesn't mean that you'll be able to do other important communication things, such as interpreting body language, reading the air. There's just so much more to communication than the language itself. So
yeah, definitely. But even so, the language is the way to understand that, isn't it? I think that the way there are, for example, pauses in Japanese conversations, that's something that you pick up on when you understand the language. And it might be difficult for people to, if they don't understand Japanese, if they're looking in from outside, to even realize that these pauses are happening, for example. So language and culture, they are, intertwined, aren't they? Absolutely. And my background, in particular, what I studied in Japan was anthropology and cross-cultural communication. So what that meant was that we would have lots of lessons on exactly that. So how the Japanese communication is, how it takes place between different Japanese speakers, examining their body language and the non-verbal clues and things like that. So we'd examine that in quite detail, sort of analyse it. And it's something that you can only really absorb, I think, by living there and being sort of surrounded by that every day.
What do you think are the most effective ways to learn Japanese? I know you mentioned before that a lot of your early on studies were with limited resources, but based on that and based on some of what you see available now, what do you think are the most effective ways to learn Japanese?
Well, I'm using a hybrid method at the moment, and I'm still learning. I think it's going to be it's a lifelong process, definitely. But because my background is in the sort of so-called audio-lingual method, which was the sort of mainstream method in those days, I still tend to follow that because I know it works for me. And I know I said that meant that you would listen to a recording first and then try to reproduce that same language yourself. Then you can actually apply that to different situations. Now, for example, I would record a Japanese colleague of mine when he was speaking on the phone to a Japanese client, and I'd make a copy of the script, and then I would just repeat his conversation again until I could almost sort of completely reproduce it myself without referring to the script. So I think you can make your own materials, and indeed that's what I did in the early days. Because there was such a lack of any sort of video or spoken Japanese material out there, I used to actually record my own voice and play it back. You can imagine what that can lead to, can't you? So I'm listening to my own terrible British Japanese pronunciation and I'm now copying it. And it probably made it worse, but that was sort of the only thing I had in those days. So any sort of Japanese that we could get a hold of, we used to sort of make our own materials from it. So that's one thing to do. And now, of course, there's so much out on the internet, available on the internet. You can watch Netflix programs with Japanese subtitles. I would recommend that you cover some subtitles first. Listen to the program, gauge your understanding, and then watch the program again, this time by removing the cover from the subtitles. Or of course you can turn the subtitles off completely, or you can partly cover the subtitles on the screen, maybe by just putting a piece of paper on screen, and therefore you have to use your own sort of intuition to guess what the rest of the sentence is, to guess what you've covered up. So I think using your imagination to create learning material is a really good thing to do. There's so much out there. There's no excuse now. You know, a few clicks on Google, and you can have any sort of YouTube video within seconds. So that really, really should speed up the learning process, I think. And that's probably why we're seeing so many more really good Japanese speakers now, young people.
And another awesome tool, I don't know how new it is, but it's relatively new. There's a extension, I don't know if it's just Chrome, called Language Learning with Netflix.
Oh, all right, okay. I've heard about it. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, so it helps you find the shows that are in Japanese, and then it provides you with the various choices for subtitles. So you could do it with kanji, without kanji, English and Japanese, just English, just Japanese. So it gives you a lot of control over what you're seeing. You can also speed it up and slow it down when they're speaking if you would like. And a combination I use if I'm trying to gather vocabulary for like a Anki deck or something. It's another extension called Rikai-kun. So I'll link those both of those in the description of the episode. But yeah, that's been a good way for me to collect vocabulary to learn personally.
Yeah, definitely. It's the same method, isn't it? But with such great technology now. I mean, the whole point of like you cover something up, and then it forces you to think hard about what's happening. So back in the early days when I was teaching English in Japan, I would actually we'd show for example, the news with subtitles in English on the screen, but I would use post-it pads to cover up some of the key words, and then ask the students to really focus on those areas that were covered by the post-it pads. So they had to really sort of drill down, and so that sort of thing. Because something that I test myself with is to play a sentence and try and write it down word for word. I think that's quite hard to do, because quite often there's a little part that you can't always, you can't catch.
Right.
And so it really, really focuses the mind. And you might be surprised how much you miss actually. When you put pen to paper and write down every single part of that sentence, it can be quite eye-opening to think that, oh, actually, I didn't catch that. So I would suggest doing that now and again. So the two approaches are more of a general approach where you listen to the whole of a speech or something and just get the gist. Or same applies to reading, doesn't it? You could skim through a newspaper article and just get the main point. And then the second approach is to drill down into specific points. If it's listening, then I think you should try to capture every single little sound, because that will really sort of focus you. And something that I've learned from my daily work as an interpreter is that audio quality is critical. So the slightest sort of glitch in for example a Skype meeting, that can really affect your understanding, especially I think in the case of Japanese, because you might miss if a sentence is negative or positive just by missing that little part. So that again, because so many people are working over the internet now, and we're doing online sessions, you really have to attune your ear to every single little part. And any training that allows you to improve that, I think, is very valuable, very, very worthwhile.
You just kind of have to find what works best for you, and don't be afraid to experiment a little bit to find other things too.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, as I said, because we were so limited as to what we could get our hands on in those days, we just had to use our initiative and create things. But I've come across good, teaching methods and bad ones. For me, a bad teaching method is when everybody is in a classroom and you're perhaps practicing reading a passage from a book, and the teacher says, right, okay, start here, and make your way around the class in order. So your turn's going to come in about 5 minutes time. You can just switch off until your turn comes. And to be honest, that was sort of the way that Japanese was taught, both in the UK, at least in those days, and also when I went to Japanese language school. Whereas at that time in Europe, we were exploring different language teaching methods. Now, I actually completed a TESOL training course before I went to Japan. So I spent a year learning different methodology and also practicing in a classroom with foreign students, so from all different backgrounds, French, Japanese, Spanish, or whatever. So we learned lots of quite, I think, for in those days, quite innovative training methods. And I didn't see those being used in Japan, which was a shame. I mean, just for example, when I said that when you go around in order practicing something, you could mix that up just by the teacher being more active and saying, okay, now, John-san, you read the next part. And then you don't know who he's going to be picked on next. And then, so once he's read his part, then you might say, okay, I don't know, Jane-san, you read the next part. So it keeps everybody on their toes. And that's also a method that I use when we're practicing martial arts as well. We suddenly pick on somebody to say, okay, you do the next part. Because you have to have that heightened awareness, I think. Otherwise, you just lapse into some sort of false security and you zone out. So the Japanese teaching could have been improved quite a lot, I think, if they used more sort of modern teaching techniques. But it was Japan, so kind of rote learning was the staple. I wonder if it's changed now.
The summer institute I went to in 2014 used that very traditional Japanese method, and it didn't work at all for me. So yeah, because they were also literally sitting there and then making a mark every time you made a mistake, and then taking off points for the amount of times you made a mistake. So everything was just lined up completely backwards of what it should have been to try to help people learn the language. So
I get that. I mean, it was frustrating for me because having come from that English teaching background, I wanted the teachers in Japan to use more sort of more interesting sort of techniques, but they whether they were not known in Japan at the time or whether it was just a natural sort of hesitation to use anything different, I don't know. But yeah, it could have been far more effective looking back. I mean, the material that we used as well, some of it was very dated, whereas I don't think we used hardly any sort of modern content material at all. So still, anyway, that can't be changed. But I think what I wanted to say is that there is so much out there now. There's no excuse really for not making quite rapid progress, I think.
I don't know what my excuse is for not making much progress, but that's another story.
Well, I don't know. Hopefully after this podcast ended, you'll be totally reinvigorated and take a look at some of those videos that I mentioned from the speech contest in London. And I challenge anybody not to be inspired after watching some of those.
For sure. So then, apart from those more traditional teaching methods, are there any other ways of learning the language that you think aren't very effective?
Okay, methods that aren't very effective. I think, and you alluded to this just a moment ago, there was some sort of definitely an attitude on the side of the Japanese teachers in Japan, in the school I went to, whereby they would correct mistakes instantly. I don't think they had that way of thinking or that approach that making mistakes were a natural thing and that it was indeed a necessary phase to go through in order to make that language actually part of you. So if, for example, you would say something and it was wrong, then they would sort of jump in at that point and correct you, which is quite demotivating. And I think what's really important is when you're learning to speak a language is to be given the opportunity to say what you want, even if it's wrong, and then you think where you've perhaps made a mistake afterwards. Whatever, you have to give the speaker time to work out what they're trying to say in their head, and you have to sort of guide them along with that. So when I was teaching English, I'd always allow the students to speak quite freely. I'd encourage them and then give them some feedback afterwards, such as, well, I think maybe you could have said it this way, but I wouldn't jump in and sort of stop them in mid-flow, because that is, I think, very ineffective to do that. And it's quite irritating when you're at the other end of that as well. And I think probably the Japanese teachers weren't aware of that, whether it was because they didn't have very much experience of learning languages themselves, and I don't know. But yeah, it's something you have to develop at your own speed, isn't it? And I think the teacher should be there to help you do that, to guide you along, not to stop you straight away.
The student needs to kind of digest and metabolize the language point. They can't just memorize, insert words, and press repeat. It's a little bit of a deeper process than that. Which
it is, yeah, it is. Now, although saying that at the very beginning, I know I said that I like the audiolingual method, which means you do repeat. But I would say, at least for me, and everybody has different learning styles, and in my particular case, I had to get the foundations sort of totally absorbed first, and then I could start exploring. So once I had those building blocks in place, then I could start using those. And that goes back to the martial arts example, doesn't it? Where you, first of all, you follow the kata and you learn that properly, and then you start to explore once you've got to that stage. So I think, going back to your question about ineffective teaching learning methods, I think maybe starting to run before you can walk could, in the long term, perhaps have a negative effect. So get those basics down first.
Because another fear for teachers of language is just students memorizing things wrong, learning things incorrectly, and then having a hard time relearning. It's a little bit of a balance.
It is, you're right, yeah, and that whole thing about learning something wrong and not being able to correct it afterwards, that is very, very true in everything, isn't it? Especially if it's a physical activity, because then you've got muscle memory, and that is very hard to unlearn, definitely. But you're right, the same thing with languages. I mean, I'm sure I learned things that were wrong at the time, because I was teaching myself in the very early days. The first few years, it was all done from a book and a recording. And so, yeah, I guess you can't avoid learning some things wrong, but you just have to make do with what you've got, don't you? And hopefully those mistakes will be ironed out over time. But I also found that the Japanese were a little reticent about giving negative feedback, as they are in business sometimes. The same thing for language learning. They would quite rarely correct you if you were wrong. So you could often be encouraged to keep repeating the same mistake, because nobody sort of felt that they should correct you, at the risk of perhaps making you lose face or whatever. But for me, I wanted sort of that sort of feedback. I wanted to make a mistake, have it corrected, and then move on to the next level. And it's frustrating if people don't do that for you.
Once somebody has decided to commit to becoming a high-level Japanese speaker, are there any unique challenges that they face in the workforce in Japan?
Well, in the workforce in Japan, or did you also mean working for Japanese organisations outside of Japan?
Yeah, both.
Would you include that?
I would include that for sure.
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, first of all, you have to get the trust from your Japanese colleagues that they sort of believe in your Japanese. There are, and that can be quite hard to do sometimes, because I'm sure you've come across that situation where you might speak Japanese and people might reply to you in English, or it happens a lot for some reason. It always happens with train staff in my case. That was quite a common thing. You'd ask where the train to Tokyo, the platform for the train to Tokyo wasn't, and they'd always say over there or something, or no English, or I know speak English, or something like that. So that getting the other party to actually have confidence in you that they can converse with you in Japanese, that can be the first hurdle that you have to get over. Once you've proven that, then it's okay. But on a first time meeting, then sometimes that can be difficult. I mean, have you ever come across that sort of feeling of sort of nervousness on the behalf of the Japanese when they think, oh, can I really talk to this non-Japanese person in Japanese or not? And I know that some Japanese even have a difficulty talking to people in Japanese if they don't have a Japanese-looking appearance. It's just some sort of mental block that kicks in, and people have told me that before on a few occasions. So getting over that can be hard. But I think, as we're seeing, there are more and more people, non-Japanese speaking Japanese on the TV now and YouTube or whatever. So people, shouldn't feel that so much. But definitely, it is it was there, and I think it's still there to some extent.
Because I hear a lot of people talk about that, but I do think that it is starting to change because I personally haven't experienced that so much yet. Usually they're just so relieved that they don't have to use their English that they're more than happy to speak to me in Japanese. But yeah, so I can see how that's a problem, but I think it is slowly changing, luckily.
And I think maybe to leave that good first impression, something you should concentrate on is, we said Keigo earlier, of course, but at a level below that, perhaps it's just about pronunciation, I think, intonation. So being as natural as you can, as close to a Japanese pronunciation as possible, with trying to avoid that sort of typical, how should we say, sort of English speakers rising intonation. When you're watashi wa Graeme to moshimasu, that sort of, that sort of awful accent. I mean, I'm not saying that my accent is very, very good. I've still got some sort of, I must have a British accent when I speak Japanese, but I think you know what I mean when you see on TV, sometimes people use stereotypical foreigners speaking Japanese, and they'll always use that really high voice. And so if you can avoid that, I think that you'll leave a good first impression.
Yeah, I wonder if that was a little bit of a factor for me, just because, like I said before, I'm not naturally a language learner, but my family has always been one that likes to do plays, and that includes accents and things like that. So from a young age, I was always doing accents.
Oh,
So yeah, for some reason, my pronunciation was always miles ahead of my actual language skills, which got me into trouble sometimes. But I wonder if that helps people believe my Japanese level, even if they believe it's higher than it actually is.
Oh no, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because speaking a language and doing interpreting even as a job is acting to some extent, because you have to become the voice of the person you're interpreting for, don't you? So in a way, you kind of take on their thinking and their mindset as well, and you kind of, you have to project their intentions through what you're saying. So you have to almost become, sort of act as if you are them sometimes. And so that's definitely one thing. So yeah, it's a kind of drama, isn't it? You take on the role of somebody else. So anybody who's naturally good at acting or drama, I think, will probably be good at learning a foreign language. And accents, yes, because there are some really, really good people out there on YouTube at the moment, aren't there, who've sort of really mastered a good Japanese accent, and some of them are running classes and things online. So definitely, I would say, spend a lot of time on getting your accent, down pat as best as you can. Work on that, and then you won't come across as sounding like a typical Japanese-speaking foreigner, which probably grates on the ears of some Japanese people. I'm not saying that I don't fall into that trap. What I'm saying is, spend as much time working on your accent as possible. I'm not saying that mine is perfect.
Nope. Especially once you get into pitch accent and things like that. That's a whole other issue altogether.
Yeah, I've seen those videos, and that's different. So no, beyond me.
Yes. Yes, try not to worry about everything at once, but I think that your method of listening and repeating is very helpful for helping with accents as well.
Well, I mean, and people have pointed that out to me as well, that the accent is, well, it's okay, shall we say. And I would put that down to following the audiolingual course. Now, the speakers on that course were NHK announcers. That's the Japanese sort of equivalent to the BBC, isn't it, for the listeners out there who might not know. So I think they were using very good models. And I think just because I put in that sort of constant repetition type practice, that I was probably able from a very early stage to do that. But if you start from reading and then you start hearing Japanese at a later stage, it's probably too late. So start from your ears and then produce verbally and then read. That's my recommendation. It works for me, not for everybody.
How do you study kanji?
At the very beginning, it was a case of maybe 1 or 2 every day. Tracing, first of all. I had just had a basic textbook that had something like, I don't know, 1,000 kanjis in there, and you learn them one by one. I don't think there was any particular order to them. It was just rote learning. So although now, of course, I would highly recommend some of the language learning apps that are out there. In fact, my daughter, she's learning using one of them now, and she does her daily sort of kanji practice using that app, and she's making really good progress with it. But I didn't have the luxury of that in the early days, of course. So it was a case of pen and paper. But I realised that after a while, you could link a core kanji with other related kanji. So what I mean by that is we might take, I don't know, the kanji for tree, which is ki, isn't it? And you might write that on a piece of paper. And then I try to think of all the other kanji or vocabulary that I could think of that included ki. And then I just do like a mind map, linking those kanji on, with the central kanji in the middle, and just try and increase the vocabulary that way. In order to do that, you just have to basically memorize the kanji by sheer repetition. For me, that's what works. I know other people can learn kanji by sort of using various sort of visual tricks, and that's great for them. But no, I used to just practice stroke after stroke. Now, my writing actually is very bad. I'm left-handed, and that used to horrify the Japanese teacher, who would always, she'd even try to make me use my right hand, which of course we know that's what happens in Japan, but it never worked. So even now I write kanji left-handed. But I think because of that rote learning and that constant practice, I've actually managed to retain a lot of kanji in my head now, even though I hardly ever write anything. It's all done obviously on a keyboard, but I need a visual sort of clue to produce them. And even Japanese people, they forget to write kanji, don't they? Especially these days, especially Japanese leaving abroad, for example. But what that means is if I can refer to that kanji just for a split second, it'll come back and I'll be able to write it, which is really strange. But without that visual stimulus, sometimes I can't do it. But the point is, it's in there somewhere. And I think that's only because of the constant sort of practice, which, we might fill a sheet of A4 with one character, and then turn the page and just do another page of a different character. It was very much a case of ni san chi go roku shichi hachi kuju, like that. Practice. I mean, there might be shortcuts now using the apps, and I really hope there are. But at least what I think I've realised is that method allows you to retain that kanji, and it's been 35 years now for some of them. They're still there, so. I can't recommend actual physical pen and paper work. I can't recommend that high enough.
Yeah, there's something, it just interacts with your brain differently when you're actually writing it out versus just doing electric flashcards.
I use flashcards now, though, Lydia. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I do too. But
they're great. They are really good. But I just like to have a combination of both methods. And as you said, actually writing it down, for some reason that seems to get your brain working in a whole different way. So I'm sure somebody with more expertise than me could explain the reason for that, but it seems to happen.
Well, thank you for that. It's great to hear other people's interactions and experiences with kanji, because it seems like a mixed bag for people. Some people just adore them, some people hate them, some people it's just a chore. So thanks for sharing that.
Well, I suppose for me, I'm sort of reading them, maybe 10 hours a day or more, aren't I? So, and it's been like that every day for the last, So, if I couldn't manage them, there would be a problem, I think, by now.
So then, in your life, do you have an example of a communication breakdown that you've had in Japan due to cultural differences?
Communication breakdown. Well, communication breakdown. Let me see. I mean, in my role as a corporate translator, I come across communication issues on a regular basis, of course, and I've seen many of them over the last few decades. To the extent that I've run many sort of training courses on improving that sort of communication between Japanese people and non-Japanese people. But I'd say that the biggest cause of those sorts of issues would be a difference in expectations on both sides, a difference in assumptions. The Japanese have certain expectations towards work or working hours, quality, etc. And Europeans might have different ones. Even amongst different European countries, of course, the degrees of such expectations and assumptions differ quite widely. So I think that's where it comes from. Anyway, that's where it stems from sometimes. The best way to get over those, I think, is to share each side's thoughts. Because unless you have knowledge of what the other side is expecting or hoping for, then I think it's very hard for you to realise where the problem is coming from. And it might be easier for us in the unique position that we're in to say, the Japanese probably want this, and the Americans or the British expect this, and that's where the difference is. But your average Japanese person who hasn't had training or much exposure to how the Americans or the Europeans work or think, they're not going to be able to do that. And that's where the frustration comes from, I think. So it's all about sharing, isn't it? Sharing our own thoughts and ideas as much as possible, so that we can arrive at some sort of middle ground. But without sharing that information to start with, where do you start from?
It's definitely important to have that sort of cultural bridge to an extent in organizations. So if you can be that bridge, you can help prevent a lot of difficulties.
Well, I'm hoping to anyway. And I love doing that. For some, this is my natural sort of position in life, I think now. So yeah, you have to be neutral. You have to be, I think, quite patient. You have to have a lot of empathy with both sides, and you have to, I think, be able to detect where the miscommunication has gone wrong, because you think, this side haven't picked up on a certain nuance here, or this side they just haven't realised that the other side is perhaps dissatisfied with something. Or it's all about identifying those points first, I think, and then explaining them, actually bringing them to the table, and then the next stage, of course, is for everybody involved to find some sort of compromise. It's almost a type of counselling, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what you need to do sometimes. So unless you open up and share your feelings, both sides are going to constantly be in a state of sort of dissatisfaction with the other sometimes.
You have to be a little bit of an investigator. And then you have to
Yeah,
translate what happened into both cultures so that people can understand.
definitely. Otherwise, these things sort of they stew, and then they'll blow up all of a sudden. So to avoid that happening, I think it's better to act as early as possible if there is some sort of cross-cultural communication issue occurring. Otherwise, once you go past a certain point, it's quite hard to go back and change it, I think.
So then if you were chatting with somebody who was going to go to Japan for business for the first time, and you really only had time to teach them one thing about Japan, its culture, before they left, what would you teach them?
Oh, okay. Probably just to remain calm, patience, open your eyes, and try and take in as much as you can, and trying to sit back perhaps and let things evolve in front of you, and then perhaps join the conversation. In other words, don't steamroller things. Don't go in, from the start being forceful or sort of trying to push your ideas straight away. It's much more a case of allowing things to happen, I think. So I think that sort of approach is quite important, because sometimes the Japanese negotiators can sit back and allow you to say everything that they want to hear from you, and they'll give you that opportunity to keep going. And you might fall into that trap of revealing some sort of information that you shouldn't have, and they've been waiting for that. So there's always that possibility.
Yeah, I think it can be easy to let your anxiety take over in those situations, but the more mindful you can be, the more effective you'll be, especially early on, but always.
It's easier said than done. You often see TV personalities going to Japan to make programs in TV, the documentaries or whatever, and they look like fish out of the water sometimes when everything is new to them, or they don't know how to react. Or so I think it's very much a case of just always remaining as calm as possible, and don't jump to conclusions either.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you would like to share with my audience before we head off?
Well, if your audience are learning Japanese, then I would say don't give up. Look at some of the the videos that are out there on YouTube for inspiration, and take every opportunity you can to learn Japanese or use Japanese, because what you learn today might come in useful in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. You'd be surprised. So really, really expand your sort of range of activity, and nothing will be wasted, from my experience. I mean, there's some things that I've done, I thought, well, why am I doing this? But then a few years later, there's an opportunity. Wow, I'm glad I did that, because this has now become useful. So that happens all the time. So just really expand the things you read, the things you look at on TV, or any sort of exposure to the language. Take it.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. Be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode to learn more about Graeme and find some links to the learning resources and inspiration that he mentioned. Please remember to go ahead and subscribe and leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. And feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. Also, be sure to reach out if you would like to contribute as a guest on the podcast to share your own cultural insights into doing business in Japan. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.